Welcome back to Serious Talk, Salesforce at Scale. I'm your host, Greg Banks. Thanks for coming along with us today. Here's a pattern that quickly sinks good Salesforce project. Everyone agrees to build long before anyone agrees on why. Today, we slow that down. Joining me is my co-host, Allie Nelson, and John Cooper, an account director here at Sirius. And yes, he's a former Green Beret, though that's not the story we'll be talking about today. John is here for something every Salesforce leader wrestles with: the business value assessment, the artifact that ties every dollar you spend back to the strategic goal before a single thing gets built. We get practical about where the BVA starts, why you build from strategy down instead of metrics up, and how it exposes gaps and scope creep. All right, let's get into it. All right, welcome to Serious Talk, Salesforce at Scale. Allie, co-host today, welcome back. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Greg.
I know you're on the verge of doing a little travel with Witness, and we'll do a sidebar into that a little bit later. But we got a new guest on the show today, not new to our company, but new to the show, Jonathan Cooper. I have struggling with Jonathan. You're John. John, good to have you here today, man. Appreciate you making time for us.
Excited to be here. Excited to talk about business value.
Awesome. Absolutely. Yeah, I've been trying to drag John on for 6 months to talk about veteran stuff. We'll crack the seal on that a little bit today, but he will be coming back for another episode on the Military Minute series. But John's in here today. He's an account director here at Sirius Solutions. If you haven't met him, John's work isn't about configuring Salesforce. It happens a level above that. It's in the harder conversations, helping clients work through some of their toughest challenges. And if you've ever been a part of a client putting in a large program, that's usually when you find out there's things we need to talk through, and we haven't done all that yet. So John's really good at coming in and helping out with some of those conversations. And here's what makes John so good at that. John spent an extensive career as a Green Beret in the U.S. Army Special Forces, operating in high-stakes environments where the decisions were hard and the consequences were real. Staying clear-headed under pressure, weighing tough calls, and guiding people to solid outcomes is not a skill he picked up in a boardroom. It's how he's operated his entire career. Exactly what brings value to his clients today. John, thanks again, man. Great to have you here. Thank you for your service. But today we're going to crack into business value assessment. And I'll be the first to raise my hand and say, I see phrases on LinkedIn and places all the time. And I go, huh? What is that? So I know what this is because I've been in some of the conversations. But Allie, why don't you, because you tend to be on the leading edge of a lot of our client conversations, being on the sales side of things, why don't you help frame this up, and then we'll let John really get in the weeds of what he does with it.
Yeah. So, as we're starting to talk to a lot of our clients on the front end of sales, a lot of times we start those conversations by asking about like high level dollars and cents and high level goals. And a lot of customers will just come to us and say, can you give me a ballpark of how much is going to be and can you build everything we want? And we have to kind of pause for a minute and say, well, hold on. We need to know what you want to get out of this first and what your goals are so that we can make sure that we're aligning properly. We can, technically speaking, we can build whatever you want to build, but we need to make sure it's worth it to you. And to determine that worth, we really want folks like John to be able to help have some business conversations and understand what value this is going to provide for customers. So I will admit myself that sometimes I see an acronym like BVA just come up on my screen and I'm like, I don't know that I remember this one. So John, do you want to just kick us off by letting us know what's your definition of that BVA, business value assessment?
Thanks, Allie. So business value assessment really it's a living document where we start to capture the different elements of conversations, from the strategic elements, the operational and the tactical elements, and starting to pull them together so that we can trace where the status quo is, where the current view is, and then where the future view kind of connects, right? So the business value assessment is identifying the priorities of the business strategically, right? What is the strategy? What is the goal of the business? Then you go down to the goals. What within that strategy, what are our goals as a business to achieve for those priorities? And then we start to get into the details. Then we start to get into the objectives about this engagement for this project, for this line of effort. What are some objectives that we could tie into those things? And we can directly trace where that strategy starts to connect down into the tactics of delivery. And then you take that, and it's a snapshot, it's a frame, it's an evolving frame that then communicates across the business so that we're talking the same language, we're talking in the same direction, we're oriented in the right direction according to everybody involved, whether it be the developer or the CEO. Right? Everybody should be seeing the same view and aligned together with a clarity of purpose. And so that kind of clarity of purpose is the effect of the BVA in its best execution.
That you said it's not necessarily just top level executives. It's really making sure that everyone who's going to be involved, because in our projects, yes, we start with talking with the executive suite about, hey, big scale, what Salesforce can do for you. But throughout the course of a project, we're interacting with leadership, with managers, all the way down to end users. And I think just that idea of everyone understanding the why behind things is really critical in our projects. So as we get started with a lot of our implementations, I'm sure that a lot of listeners will be familiar with clients saying, why do we need to spend time doing this when we could just get into building in Salesforce? So can you talk us through kind of why it's important for folks to take that pause and take that time at the beginning of an implementation to build out a BVA?
Yeah. Well, it has the purpose of identifying where gaps are at in the preconceived notions. So people could have a vision about what the strategy, what the return on investment is going to be from a implementation, from a project. But oftentimes, if that's not defined, if they're not actually putting that down and codifying it into an artifact, then there's people talking past each other. So at the very highest level, it codifies the strategy, right? And it forces the function of identifying. If there isn't one already codified, it goes through the function of delivering that. But that's kind of you would hope that's a prerequisite. You would hope that that's something that's done beforehand. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it is. At that point, it becomes a connecting the dots and making sure that the statement, that the orientation of the project, the statement of work line items connect back to those strategies and those priorities, right? If you don't have an element in this, going through the process of doing the BVA exposes the opportunity to really flush those pieces out and identify the gaps. You can talk at a high level and those gaps kind of get papered over. But when you start putting things down on a traceability matrix, specifically on an artifact that lives together, they become glaringly obvious where we need to do some more rigorous analysis at either side of the spectrum. And we can kind of talk through the visuals, and maybe I can share some of the visuals about how these things connect up.
And I think what I also really like too is this idea that it kind of helps normalize the terminology gap between executives and end users significantly, because sometimes, I'll hear some, maybe like vague is the right term. I'll hear some maybe vague language in, when someone's just talking about improving efficiency. But when we want to talk to end users and managers of teams about what that actually means for the metrics that they're looking at every day, I think it helps connect those dots and make sure that everyone's in alignment. What are we actually talking about when we're setting these goals and objectives for the project?
Yeah, I think, Michael, I know we call this series Salesforce at Scale, right? A lot of times what we're talking to about clients is somebody who didn't have Salesforce when we're putting in, but there are times when somebody's put it in, and what do companies do? They don't generally get way out ahead of the curve and do things before they need them. They've got a solution and they get bigger and they diversify it, whatever. And all of a sudden, like, this tool is just not cutting it anymore. So you're almost in a desperate place needing to react. So to me, some really basic terminology, unmet expectations are an absolute cancer to a project. What I think this does is it forces people at all levels, right, from the executive team down to the people you're going to meet with to execute the project. It forces some vocabulary and expectations to come out. It's not just because we all got to the end of whatever the last solution was and said, that's definitely not enough. We got to do something. Now we're doing something, and it can't just be, I saw something flashy over there, I want one of those. Right. It's really trying to, I think, John, one of the first words you said was about strategic goals. We don't understand the strategy, then there's going to be underlying expectations that people have and whispers that go that will be unmet, or there'll be change orders at the end of the project because you waited too late to bring them up. So yeah, we've seen this play out in 1,000 ways, but just want to chime in there. Some scars are coming up.
I think, John, you have a couple examples of this, right?
Yeah. So and I was kind of going to jump into the strategy piece exposes itself first, but it's at the tail end where we define the metrics that then report back and provide the return on investment, those numbers, that quantification back to the strategy. That is where it takes the diligence of going through the process. There have been times when we have reconciled 5,000-hour contracts down to a 3-hour plus or minus valuation, and every element, every hour of the statement of work connects directly back to their priority list. And they can say, these hours allocated on the statement of work are broken out according to our priority list and our strategic goals down to the minute or down to the hour, right? And it directly goes to knowing the inputs and knowing the outputs of a project in a quantified sense where we can actually judge success. Everybody, you could there's the vibe culture, right? There's the vibe of success. And that's not to say that that's not important. There's a certain personality of a system that gets put in place. There's the perception of how easy this is or hard this is. But when it comes down to judging success, getting down to those quantifiables and rolling that up gives you hard facts to then judge. And what I've done in the past is go retrospectively on the last. Greg mentioned, hey, sometimes we're not the first people walking in the door, and they're not rolling off of spreadsheets into Salesforce. They're rolling off of a previous implementation in another system or an existing Salesforce implementation. So let's go back and look at that last one. Let's see what kind of putting yourself in the place you were when you started that to where you ended. Let's look at how that maps. Then we can say, now we've got a rep under our belt. Now let's look at what we want to do going forward and how we want to achieve success and define it and then actually measure it. Because if you can't measure it, you can't deliver it. So yeah, that is, there's been several different variations. It's ultimately critical that we match how we go about it with the organization and where they're at in their place, in their life cycle, and their evolution. So it is a bit of art to pulling it into place, but generally the major muscle movements are pretty standard.
And so we've done this a couple times. This is a framework that you've been working on with several of our customers. So can you give us a couple examples of some of these benefits you've talked about, some of the reasons why, but in practice and how you've found success with that business value map?
Yeah. So what I'll talk about maybe an instance where there was some ambiguity around what we were going to be doing, right? What the scope was going to be. And kind of the first stab at it was really kind of, I want to say, maybe throwing spaghetti at the wall, seeing what stuck. And I think stepping back, when we did that, we did an assessment of what stuck and what was on the wall. And we identified, hey, there's 37 objectives here. Right? Let's take that back and refine it. Let's actually put some rigor against going back up chain, connecting that back up to your priorities and your strategy. And in doing that, we were able to refine it down to 24. So it went from, I think, the 37 to 24. And then we were able to identify, okay, so we've got some savings. We were able to carve things out that we initially thought were going to be important, but it's not important yet. In this phase, it's not critical because it's not really part of what we had as a strategic target. Then we were able to open up additional capacity, and they were able to say, okay, now given this new framework, these new 24 objectives, we've got some extra capacity. We've got some extra budget. Do we want to save that budget and carve it back in? Or do we want to expand and maybe look into a new line? We were able to actually add some things that ended up being critical later on that wouldn't have been exposed as an opportunity had we not done the rigor of cutting it down on the front end. So this is not to say that every opportunity of going through this cuts it down so significantly by a third, but it is very plausible that it goes in either of two directions. We either identify, hey, the priorities are actually bigger than what we anticipated. We need more. Or, hey, given what we have as a priority, we can cut this down. We can save some time and budget right now, save that for a future phase. So that's maybe an example of how it's played out. The other aspect is I've walked in the door doing this with a client where that rigor wasn't done up front. And we had to go back and say, what are the metrics here that are driving success? We had to then do a significant amount of work to define and report on those metrics, then report back. Turns out it was actually all green lights. It was all goodness, but they weren't able to communicate how successful it had all the good vibes, but the reporting back up and getting people to buy in and see the value that weren't involved in the project. We were actually report on percent improvement that really mattered to the business stakeholders across the organization.
Love that you call that out, because I feel like that's a gap that we have often, where there's a difference between qualitative and quantitative data. And the hard part is that qualitative data, how people feel about something, doesn't necessarily always translate to, cold hard success, dollars saved, time saved, et cetera. And so I think it's really important that you call out that, hey, this really makes sure that we can take how people are feeling about a certain maybe objective, and we can tie that directly to the numbers of what's actually changing there. I want to talk a little bit about how we start to build out, how we do this assessment, how we build out this value map. Because whenever we go in talking to a new company who's maybe not as familiar with structuring their thoughts in this framework, especially, sometimes we get a lot of thoughts at us. They come and they say, hey, we want to buy Salesforce because we want to be 33% more efficient, and they start with, here's a metric we want to hit. But I know that you have like a certain order you recommend we do this in. So can you talk about kind of the steps that we take to start to build this value map?
Yeah, I want to circle back to that. If they've got a metric in mind, that's actually, I love when there's a golden metric, right? When there is a one ring to rule them all metric that we can then judge based off, because it gives that snapshot even clearer than a dashboard with several things up there. When there's one hard hitting golden metric, man, that is a sweet spot. But from a process perspective, when we're attacking this problem set, we really start with the executive frame, right? We start with, what are the business objectives? What are the business goals, the priorities, right? We get those down on paper. We get them so that we can start connecting the dots. Then we start going to the objectives, the tactical objectives, right? And the reason we start with the strategy is because if you start with the objectives, if you start with the tactics, they drive strategy. In a void, tactics are forced to drive strategy. And so without that guiding light, that North Star as to what we're orienting to, it will be provided in abstract by the tactics that are chosen and defined, right? So that's maybe some harkening back to my past experiences in how we're kind of orienting military operations in the same way, right? So this translates a bit to a universal truth. Once we're able to get that strategic guiding light, those things codified, we nail down the objectives, then we start identifying and connecting that to the Salesforce capabilities. And we start getting into, how can that be achieved in the technical sense, whether it be a mechanism of a module that facilitates it with a call out, hey, here's something that deviates off the capabilities that you have to do some custom development to build out to, because of the uniqueness of the priority and of the goal. So then we start being able to lattice, and we say, okay, I've got this strategy, I've got the objectives, I've got the capabilities in Salesforce, and the last piece, and most was not the cornerstone, but the last piece, the capstone of the BVA, is the metrics. This is when we really quantify and we define what those quantifications are that can connect directly back. So it becomes cyclic, a bit of a cycle, where we can then connect and say, these elements, once we have the capabilities defined, the defining of the metrics becomes much, much easier too. Because doing it in abstract, starting at the tail end, starting with the metrics, you might, I think Greg hears me say this all the time, a broken clock is right twice a day. You're going to get some metrics that are right if you just start with metrics. You're not going to be off base. You're coming to it with a lot of experience. You know the business. There are things that you'll point to, but they might not be the critical determinant of success of the implementation or the project that really need to be reported on. And that exposes itself when you kind of walk the dog and get down the pipeline to the metrics. Now you're in, you're hitting center mass, you're hitting an actual characterization of the project, of the implementation. And so really walking that left to right from that strategic level down to the most tactical level of reporting on metrics. So the last and most critical piece of the BVA is actually the hardest part to execute on, and that is making it a living document. Right? It's not something that needs to be built and go on a shelf and then revisited at the end of the project to say, how successful were we? This is something that gets revisited critically at milestones, but really throughout your project. And you're retesting the priorities that you had as a business. Maybe that's evolved. You're retesting the goals on those priorities, and you're reevaluating. Maybe technology has changed. Maybe an opportunity has popped up where you're actually able to have a different capability. And so if you're not pressure testing this consistently throughout, you're going to end up with metrics that are somewhat disconnected from where the project evolved to be. And so the value is not in the BVA. The value is in creating the BVA, right? The same as a plan. And so the process of building it, the process of revisiting it, is the forcing function that improves the project team, and at all levels, whether it be the executive sponsors down to the execution and developers. And that process of defining it and refining it is what provides the value, right? That's what provides the synchronization and the clarity of purpose across the stakeholders. So there's the how to do it, but that's maybe less important than just doing it. just executing on it. A poorly planned operation executed with motivation and efficiency can achieve a heck of a lot. And so that's an aspect that I think it bears repeating, over and over again as these engagements evolve.
Yeah. And I think that from a technical and delivery perspective, there are two areas of that I think are super helpful. And the first one is that in this framework, metrics are tied directly to capabilities. And since we align Salesforce capabilities to our goals, so we know that we're using the right tools, but being able to define exactly where a metric is going to live within those capabilities helps remove all ambiguity when we're starting to design that solution. So thinking about when somebody tells me, I want my team to handle customer issues more efficiently. Okay, well, that could be a lot of places in the platform. That could be the service team closing cases faster. It could also be shorter phone calls. It could also be task durations. Like, where exactly does that fit? So on the design side, it just removes all the other options. So we are really drilled down into exactly what is our goal actually talking about. So I think the capabilities alignment is the first thing that's really helpful. But then also the idea that this document is something that is supposed to stay present for delivery teams. It's supposed to be with them as they're building means that anytime, and any other consulting firms will be with us on this, like, you've seen scope creep. We're all familiar with what scope creep is. And whenever something new comes up, we're able to bring up this value map and we're able to say, hey, this new thing that we're looking for, does it align with one of our strategic outcomes? Does it align with one of our goals? Does it fit into one of our capabilities? Will it contribute to one of these metrics? And if we can't align it to anything in there, then it's a living document. We can say, is there a new strategic outcome that we're aiming for? Is there a new goal that's come up that we need to adjust for? Or is this something that maybe isn't as much of a priority as we felt it was? So it can really guide a lot of that decision making and sometimes take the emotion out of it. Even though this is not like something that we're all doing in our personal lives, we spend a lot of time at work. And sometimes we do get really emotional about things changing in our workplace and the tools that we're using every single day. So it can help us hit the pause button in that situation and say, hey, let's bring back that value map. Let's bring it up. Let's take a look at it. And let's see if we need to make any changes. But let's think through this using this established framework that we've all agreed is going to get us to the end goal of this project. So yeah, from that delivery mindset, it's just so helpful to have and to reference. And I can't say enough how much I've never regretted everyone being on the same page during an implementation.
Yeah, no doubt. And in terms of total years in the ecosystem, I've never seen anybody in any org anywhere say, that's it, we're done. You just don't get there, right? You don't generally buy Salesforce because your company that's not growing, evolving, changing your product line, whatever. There's always time to do more. This takes me back to the analogy. You heard the professional that's got the big jar on their desk and he puts like 25 golf balls in there. How many think it's full? And then he starts pouring pebbles in there and then he starts putting sand in there and then he starts putting water. You can always put more in, but if you don't make sure up front, the core strategic things that matter have become a part of what it is you're aiming at, you can't shove them in after the fact. If I've got a jar full of golf balls, you're not going to squeeze a softball in at the end if that's the main goal that we forgot to talk about. So we don't believe it's malicious or whatever, that our clients don't think about these things on the front side. This is about going back all the way to the intro, John. It's having that harder conversation up front of, well, right now we're on a spreadsheet and we use fax machines and we have clipboards. Our people carry clipboards in the field. Well, you probably don't have a baseline on turnaround time or finishing a report. Any of that, you have no baseline metrics to even start pulling from. So this is kind of taking the abstract, I have nothing or real lack of clarity, and really helping the business refine into A, the things that matter, B, what is it you want to see? Quantifiable or qualifiable? What are those things that are going to really look like success in your eyes? Because it is a momentum game.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
If you can get the executives to feel like a success and they have that vision and that plays into the people managers and then the people in the field and they go, yeah, we were scared to death, but yeah, that worked. This is okay. Now you've got everybody aligned and they're excited. And it's so much easier to build on momentum once you start out with an assessment that defines what it is we're aiming at.
And I think also we have a lot of hard conversations around money and dollars. We kind of have a philosophy that we never want to waste customers' money. That's not a good partnership. We like to be a good partner. And this helps us articulate where money is going. In today's economy, everyone's hyper aware of where dollars are spent. And we want to make sure that we're able to say, hey, this is exactly where your money is going on this map. here are the strategic outcomes that you outlined. This is exactly where your money is going. And then down to that metric level, here's how much was spent to align to each of these metrics. And it also really helps to say, if you want to add, if you want to add something, let's think about, okay, how do you want to allocate your dollars within this map? So it's just another way to help people both visually and mentally think through, what does this mean for our investment? And how can we partner in protecting that investment for you? So John, any other kind of notes or takeaways you'd want to make?
No, I would probably double down on that aspect, Ali. There's a knowledge curve of growing into being able to really execute well with the systems integration with Salesforce implementation. And the more strategic alignment we can have with getting our consultants in line with the strategic goals of our client, with robust documentation and getting things on paper, then we can start to operate more autonomously and delivering value even when there's lulls in capability. So things pop up in businesses. Keeping the business going is a critical component of all of our clients. And if we have good strategic guidance, we can start to be more fire and forget because we know the decision calculus that they're using, and we can start to operate on their behest in times when that cadence is not totally afforded to us to coordinate on all these small decisions. And so, it provides a much higher delivery value, which that's a huge piece that we strive for.
So John, when you meet with clients and you go through this process, if you don't know the answer, if you've not asked the question to get an answer, feel free to say, I don't know. But would you think most clients feel like going through this process lowered their expectations of what they're going to get? Or do you think it just helped them refine it? So now they're less unmet expectations, I said, or disappointment. It's just really, really hard to recover from that. So the sooner they get a clear picture, the better chance we're going to communicate more clearly and the better chance of achieving. But what would you say people typically feel going through this?
Yeah, I think the pattern that I've seen is that they go through a bit of a journey where when they first start having to put it down on paper, they think that they're losing, they think they're getting less. And what they end up getting at the end is just as ambitious as they started out, but they had to refine it and go through the process of doing some cutting. So anytime they're starting out with having to put some bounds on it, there's a little bit of resistance. But then as it unpacks, as they define what they're actually getting, they start to see where the dots connect, and then they're much more ambitious and much more aggressive after going about the process and leaning into the process. So it takes a little bit to jumpstart it. Once you get it going, I think it opens up the door, and they can start to think about, well, if I can prove the value, if I can show the return on investment, now I can become more aggressive and go after even more things because I can now show the return on the investment that I would get from that extra piece. So there's a bit of a journey that I've seen in most of our clients, but I don't think there's a universal answer to that.
Fair enough. As people hear this, I would imagine in our audience, a lot of people are hearing this and like, that sounds good. I don't know what to walk away with and really know how to go back to my people and have a conversation about doing it. What are one or two takeaways you can give people to kind of wrap this up? If they want to go back and talk to the organization, obviously, if this piqued your interest and you see value in what we're talking about and you just want to have a conversation about it, by all means, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to get into your situation, your project, your scope, and have that conversation with you. But John, throw a couple of nuggets out there for somebody who just wants to take this back to their team.
A key takeaway, and part of when I initially introduced this concept with our clients, is if you can't trace the dollars you're spending to the return on investment that you're getting, to the strategic initiatives that your company has and the underlying reason for why you're taking this on, pause. That's not a dollar well spent. It might be, right? But you don't know that it is. You should know that it's a dollar well spent, that it's measurable, and it's going to achieve your strategic outcomes. And if you can't say that that's true, we have a pathway to allowing you to do that, right? And so lean in, trust the process, use the process, and map where your dollars are being spent to the return on investment that you're getting.
Good point. This is a terribly intriguing topic. I've talked around the topic of change management over here a few times. We've not yet done an episode on that. I see a lot of similarities. I need to go find what movie this was back in the 70s or 80s. What we have here is a failure to communicate. This solves that problem. We can't communicate till we know clearly, and we know clearly what it is that we want to get out of this. So having that hard conversation, it never gets easier to have that conversation, right? So the sooner you do it, the more clear you are. Taking the time is some of the best money you're going to spend. If for no other reason, then you got a better sense of what's coming and you're more likely to be happy with what you get. If you can't communicate it, you can't defend it or define it, then we're going to be at odds throughout the project. And that, to Allie's point, that's absolutely not a place we want to operate. That might lead to 3 years of managed services with a very disappointed client. And so we want to be a strong partner with you. We want to help you understand what it is you're aiming at in terms that can be measured, that can be communicated, and they can be delivered upon. Right? That's the underlying goal of all this. And change management might get a little more on the mechanical side of getting down to those people actually touching the tool to help them understand at the level the executives are trying to convey it. Define the why is one of the first steps you want to do on change management. This very much is a process to helping a company define the why if they've not been able to do it. So, John, thank you for the time. Man, I know this is a difficult conversation. It's a difficult topic. It's not difficult because people are scared of it. It's not difficult because you've got to launch a rocket in order to do it. It's difficult because it's taking the undefined history of all that we are and we want and trying to articulate it. So I appreciate you, helping develop this model to be something we can do for our clients, because absolutely it takes those hard conversations and makes them much more mechanical, less emotional, to Allie's point. Like, now I know we're aiming at, and I can measure the things I'm doing against that. So we know where we are. Like, we're operating in lockstep. If we can't do that, then we've got challenges. So I appreciate you doing that. But thanks for taking the time to kind of come in and share this with the audience today. I'm sure there'll be questions. In the show notes, there'll be a link to contact us at Serious Talk at SeriousSolutions.com. We look forward to hearing from you. And John, I will now chase you down about the military episode. So
you guys can expect to hear more from John on other series.
On the other series. Yeah. All right, John. Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate you coming on today. Allie, thanks as always for your help. Cheers.
Cheers.
Well, that's a wrap for this episode of Serious Talk, Salesforce at Scale. Big thanks to John Cooper for making an abstract idea concrete. This story of reconciling a 5,000-hour contract down to a near exact valuation, every hour traced to a client priority, was the clearest case for this work I've heard. And thanks to my co-host Allie Nelson for keeping it honest from the client's chair, especially her point that a good assessment ties how people feel about a change to the numbers that actually move for success. If you take one idea from John, let it be this: the value is not in the finished document, it's in building it together. That's the moment a room full of executives, managers, and developers finally start aiming at the same target. If that sounds like a project you're staring at right now, do 2 quick things. Subscribe and leave a review so more teams find the show, and check the show notes for ways to reach us. If you want to walk a business value assessment through your own org, that's exactly what our team does. Write us at SeriousTalk@SeriousSolutions.com. The address will be in the show notes. And thank you to Jason Fowler for allowing use of his song, Mystery Road. We'll see you next time.